cold leather against a bruised cheek. That was the only thing grounding Sadie. Not the men with heavy coats by the door, not the suffocating smell of stale cigar smoke, but the icy bite of the armchair against her skin. He sat across from her. 60 years of calculated violence etched into the deep lines around his mouth. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked at her trembling hands and asked the question that made her stomach heave. Rain lashed the cracked window pane of the apartment, dragging streaks of grime across the glass. Sadie sat on the edge of her unmade bed, staring at the linoleum floor. It was peeling at the corners, revealing the dark, sticky adhesive underneath. The room smelled of wet wool and the stale, cheap beer her father used to drink before his liver gave out 3 weeks ago. He left her a shoebox of faded photographs, a threadbare coat, and $40,000 of debt owed to men who did not send collection letters. Her stomach gave a hollow, cramping twist. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, half a sleeve of stale saltines. Hunger was a dull ache, but the terror was sharp, acidic, sitting right at the base of her throat. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside made her flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on the door handle, a flimsy brass thing that rattled whenever the subway passed underground. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Not the frantic scurry of her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, nor the shuffling drag of the superintendent. These footsteps had weight. They paused outside her door. Sadie stopped breathing. The silence stretched tight as a wire. She looked wildly around the cramped room. The fire escape window was rusted shut. The only weapon was a dull paring knife sitting beside the sink, caked with dried apple residue. Wood splintered with a deafening crack. The door didn't just open. It caved inward, the cheap deadbolt tearing through the doorframe. Sadie scrambled backward, her hip slamming into the edge of the rusted radiator. Pain flared white and hot, but she didn't make a sound. 2 men stepped into the cramped apartment. They looked too large for the room, their broad shoulders clad in damp, dark wool coats that smelled faintly of ozone and wet dog. The first man, a bald guy with a thick neck and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, didn't even look at her immediately. He kicked a pile of laundry out of the way with a polished leather shoe. "Thomas Miller's kid," the second man said. It wasn't a question. He had a nasal voice and chewed on a toothpick. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over her huddled form against the radiator. Sadie tried to push herself further back, but the iron pipes dug into her spine. "I don't have it," Sadie choked out. Her voice sounded foreign, thin and reedy. "He's dead. I don't have anything." "We know he's dead, sweetheart." The bald man grunted, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't need to. He reached down, grabbing a fistful of her oversized sweater. Sadie panicked. She threw her hands up, scratching wildly at his wrist. Her fingernails caught skin, drawing a thin line of blood. The man sighed, annoyed rather than angry. He twisted his grip on her sweater and shoved her hard against the wall. Her head cracked against the plaster. Black spots exploded in her vision, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. The fight drained out of her, instantly replaced by a cold, heavy paralysis. She slumped her legs, giving out, but his grip kept her upright. "Don't do that again," he said mildly, wiping the scratch on his wrist with his thumb. "Mr. Costello wants to see you." The name dropped into the room like an anvil. Albert Costello. Her father had whispered that name during his fever dreams, sweating through his sheets, begging thin air for just 1 more week. They dragged her down the 3 flights of stairs. Her sneakers dragged over the dirty steps, catching on the uneven lips of the concrete. Nobody in the building opened their doors. They all knew better. Outside, the cold rain soaked through her clothes instantly. They pushed her into the back of a waiting sedan. The leather seats were freezing. The doors locked with a heavy electronic thud that sounded entirely too final. The drive was a blur of streetlights bleeding through rain-streaked glass. Sadie sat wedged against the door, her knees pulled to her chest. She couldn't stop shivering. Her wet jeans clung to her legs, chilling her to the bone. The two men up front didn't speak. The radio played a low, murmuring sports broadcast. The sheer normalcy of it, a baseball recap, while she was being taken to what she assumed was her death, made bile rise in her throat. She pressed her forehead against the cold window. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't planning a daring escape. She was just 22, exhausted and desperately trying to remember how to breathe without gagging. The city gave way to winding, tree-lined roads. The tires hissed over wet asphalt, then transitioned to the loud, rhythmic crunch of expensive gravel. The car slowed, coming to a halt. "Out!" the bald man said, opening her door. Sadie stumbled as her foot hit the driveway. Her legs were numb from the cold and the awkward angle she had been sitting in. She looked up and felt the breath leave her lungs. It wasn't a warehouse. It wasn't some dingy basement in the back of a meatpacking plant. It was a sprawling, ivy-covered estate illuminated by warm, amber security lights. The architecture was old, heavy stone and dark wood. It looked like a fortress dressed up as a country club. They marched her up the wide stone steps and through a massive oak front door. The transition from the freezing rain to the interior was a shock to her senses. The air inside was warm, almost stiflingly so, and smelled of cedarwood beeswax polish and faintly of expensive pipe tobacco. Her cheap wet sneakers squeaked embarrassingly on the pristine marble foyer. She dripped rainwater onto a Persian rug that probably cost more than her father had made in a decade. A man in a tailored grey suit stood waiting in the hallway. He looked at her wet clothes, the dirt on her face, and wrinkled his nose in faint distaste. "In the study," he murmured to the men holding her. "He's finishing a call." They guided her down a long hallway lined with oil paintings. Sadie kept her head down, staring at the baseboards. She felt filthy. She was a stain in this immaculate house. Every sensory detail, the soft padding of their footsteps on the thick runners, the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the distance. The low hum of central heating felt oppressive, designed to remind her exactly how small she was. They pushed her into a large, dimly lit room and closed the door behind her with a soft, heavy click. Sadie stood frozen near the threshold. The room was dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the leather armchairs and the heavy burgundy drapes. It was a room built for a king or a monster. She hugged her arms tightly across her chest, shivering violently now as the warm air hit her freezing, wet clothes. Water dripped from the ends of her hair, landing with tiny rhythmic taps on the leather cushion of the chair she refused to sit in. Minutes dragged on. 10. 15. The waiting was a deliberate tactic, and it was working. Her bladder ached, her throat was sandpaper, her mind spun out horrific scenarios, each worse than the last. Would they break her fingers, make her sell herself, kill her and bury her in the sprawling woods out back? She noticed a crystal decanter of amber liquid on a side table next to a heavy glass ashtray. The smell of scotch was sharp in the air. Suddenly a side door she hadn't noticed opened. Sadie jumped, letting out a sharp gasp, her back hitting the bookshelf behind her. A heavy, hard-bound book tumbled off the shelf and hit the floor with a loud thud. Albert Costello stepped into the room. He didn't look like a movie gangster. He looked like an executive or a retired politician. He was in his early 60s, his silver hair neatly combed back. He wore a dark navy vest over a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and fading, blurry tattoos from a lifetime ago. There were deep, exhausted bags under his pale blue eyes, and his face was mapped with harsh lines. He paused, looking down at the book on the floor, then up at Sadie. He didn't say a word. He walked over his gate carrying a slight, heavy limp and bent down to pick up the book. He placed it back on the shelf mere inches from Sadie's face. He smelled of expensive shaving soap, strong black tea, and an underlying scent of something metallic and cold. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, her breath coming in short, panicked, ragged gasps. She waited for the blow. She waited for him to grab her throat. Instead, he walked past her, rounding the massive mahogany desk, and sat down heavily in his leather chair. He picked up a pair of reading glasses, slid them onto his nose, and opened a leather-bound ledger. He ignored her entirely. The silence returned, but it was worse now. It was suffocating. Sadie stood against the bookcase, her legs trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. A drop of water rolled down her nose and fell. "Sit down." His voice cut through the silence. It was a low rumble, gravelly and quiet, forcing her to strain to hear it. It wasn't a request. Sadie detached herself from the bookcase. Her legs felt like lead. She stumbled toward one of the large leather armchairs opposite his desk and sank into it. The cold leather seeped through her wet jeans. Albert turned a page in his ledger. The scrape of the thick paper sounded like a knife on bone in the quiet room. Thomas Miller. Albert said finally, not looking up. 42,500. With interest, we're looking at 51. A dead man. Sadie swallowed hard. I don't have it. Albert closed the ledger. He took off his glasses and dropped them onto the desk. He finally looked at her. His gaze was analytical cold, taking her apart, piece by piece. He looked at her wet, stringy hair, the bruised dirt on her cheek from the wall, her ripped sweater, and the way her fingernails were digging so hard into her own palms that they were turning white. "I know you don't," Albert said. "You work at a diner on 4th. You make barely enough to cover rent on that rat trap your father left you. You have $12 in a checking account." Sadie felt entirely exposed, stripped bare. "Then why am I here?" she whispered. Albert leaned back in his chair. He picked up a silver pen, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "Debts don't evaporate, Miss Miller. When a man dies, his burdens are passed to his blood. It's the order of things." "I can't pay you," she repeated, her voice cracking. "You can kill me, but you won't get money out of a corpse." "Killing you is a waste of time and ruins the carpet," Albert said matter-of-factly. He stood up slowly. Sadie shrank back into the armchair, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Albert walked around the desk. He stopped right in front of her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, casting a shadow over her. He reached out. Sadie flinched violently, throwing her arms up to protect her face, a pathetic whimper escaping her lips. Albert froze. His hand hovered in the air. He looked at her raised, trembling arms, then at her face, twisted in genuine, unadulterated terror. He slowly lowered his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly, observing her not with anger, but with a strange, clinical curiosity. The fire popped loudly in the hearth, shooting a spark against the iron screen. Sadie didn't lower her arms. She kept them up, her eyes wide, locked on his hands. She was breathing so fast she felt light-headed, the edges of her vision blurring with static. Albert didn't move back. He stayed where he was, towering over her. He tilted his head slightly, studying the defensive posture, the severe tremor in her shoulders, the way she seemed to be trying to fold in on herself, to disappear into the leather upholstery. "Put your hands down," Albert said. His voice was softer now, devoid of the sharp edge it had a moment ago. Sadie shook her head, slightly paralyzed. "I said," he repeated, lowering his tone to a slow, deliberate cadence. "Put your hands down. I'm not going to strike you." Slowly, agonizingly, Sadie lowered her arms. Her hands fell into her lap, where they continued to shake uncontrollably. She stared at his polished leather shoes. They were immaculate. She felt a hysterical urge to laugh at how clean they were compared to the mess of her life. Albert knelt. The joints in his knees popped a stark reminder of his 60 years, but he lowered himself until he was eye level with her. Sadie's breath hitched. Having him this close was suffocating. She could see the age spots on his temples, the faint silver stubble on his jaw, the terrifying absolute stillness in his pale eyes. He reached out again, moving with exaggerated slowness, like one might approach a spooked feral dog. He brought his large, calloused hand toward her face. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, bracing for the impact. But the hit never came. Instead, two rough, warm fingers gently hooked under her chin. They were firm, but the touch was startlingly light. He applied a fraction of pressure, tilting her face up towards the dim light of the study. Sadie opened her eyes. Tears were pooling in them, blurring his features. Albert's thumb brushed the cheekbone where she had hit the wall in her apartment. The skin was already swelling, turning a mottled purple. He stared at the bruise for a long time, his jaw tight. Then his gaze shifted downward, tracking the line of her throat, the erratic rapid pulse beating frantically against her skin, down to the frayed, nervous grip of her hands in her lap. He was reading her, and what he saw seemed to perplex him. In his world, women were polished, hardened, or desperately trying to be. They used their tears as weapons or their bodies as shields. But Sadie was none of those things. She was raw nerve and panic, a girl who hadn't eaten in 2 days, wearing cheap clothes, smelling of rain, and absolute despair. Albert let go of her chin. He rested his forearm on his knee, looking at her with an intensity that made her want to crawl out of her own skin. "You're shaking like a leaf," he stated quietly. Sadie couldn't formulate a response. A tear spilled over her eyelashes, cutting a hot track down her cold cheek. She sniffled immediately, hating herself for sounding so pathetic, so childish. Albert watched the tear fall, his brow furrowed, deepening the heavy lines on his forehead. He didn't see the usual cocktail of defiance and calculation he was accustomed to. He saw an innocence that had no place in his house. It wasn't the fake, weaponized innocence he dealt with. It was the crippling, paralyzing fear of someone who had never truly been in the dark before today. He looked at her bruised face, her torn sweater, the absolute absence of guile in her terrified eyes. "No man has ever touched you," the 60-year-old mafia boss asked. It wasn't framed as a question about romance. It was an observation of her extreme physical aversion, a realization of the untouched, sheltered reality she had lived in before her father's debt dragged her into the mud. The bluntness of the statement shattered whatever fragile dam was holding Sadie together. It wasn't a poetic breakdown. It was ugly. A loud, jagged sob tore out of her throat. She slapped her hands over her face, her shoulders heaving as she finally collapsed under the weight of the last 24 hours. She cried for her dead father. She cried for the empty cupboards. She cried for the heavy wooden door that had locked her in this nightmare, and she cried because the monster in the expensive suit saw right through her. Snot ran from her nose. She gasped for air, her chest hitching violently. "Please!" She cried out the word, muffled behind her trembling, dirty fingers. "Please, just let me go. I'll clean floors, I'll disappear, I won't. Please, just don't hurt me. Please!" Albert Costello didn't move. He remained kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, watching the girl completely fall apart in his armchair. For a man who had built an empire on blood and intimidation, the sound of her genuine, broken pleading felt strangely like a physical blow. He slowly stood up, looking down at the sobbing girl, the heavy silence of the room swallowed by her desperate, messy cries. The ugly, ragged sounds of Sadie's weeping filled the cavernous study, bouncing off the mahogany shelves and the heavy leather bindings. Albert Costello watched her. He did not offer a handkerchief. He did not tell her it would be all right. In his world, words like that were empty currency, and he despised a liar. He stepped back, putting distance between his immaculate suit and her wet, shivering misery. He walked around the massive desk, the faint drag of his right leg the only sound beneath her sobs, and pressed a heavy brass button on a sleek intercom box. "Stella," he said. His voice was flat, betraying nothing. A sharp burst of static preceded a crisp, older woman's voice. "Yes, Mr. Costello. Bring a towel and tea. Sugar, no milk. Have the east guest room opened?" "Right away, sir." Albert released the button. He sat down in his chair and pulled a thick file toward him, deliberately breaking his visual focus on the girl. Sadie couldn't stop crying. The adrenaline that had kept her upright since the men kicked down her door was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. She curled her knees up to her chest, right there in the armchair, pressing her dirty sneakers against the expensive leather, wrapping her arms around her shins. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the darkness behind her eyelids would swallow her whole. The door clicked open. Sadie flinched violently, a choked gasp interrupting a sob. It wasn't the men in the wet wool coats. It was a woman in her late 50s wearing a simple grey dress and sensible shoes. Stella had a face like weathered stone, lined and entirely devoid of pity. She carried a silver tray in one hand and a thick white towel draped over her forearm. Stella didn't look at Albert. She walked straight to Sadie and dropped the heavy towel over the girl's wet head and trembling shoulders. The towel smelled of bleach and dried lavender. It was blissfully, shockingly warm. "Dry your face," Stella instructed. It wasn't a comforting maternal coo, it was a brisk command. Sadie's hands shook as she reached up, pulling the thick cotton across her eyes and nose, wiping away the snot, the tears, and the rain. She dragged it over her hair, the friction pulling at her scalp. When she lowered the towel, Stella was holding out a porcelain teacup on a saucer. The china was so thin, Sadie could almost see the dark amber liquid through it. "Drink," Stella said. Sadie took it with both hands. The cup rattled furiously against the saucer, the sharp, clinking noise, embarrassing and loud in the quiet room. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. It was scalding hot black tea, heavy with refined sugar. It burned her tongue, but as the liquid hit her empty stomach, a small, involuntary shudder of relief racked her spine. Albert turned a page in his file. "Take her upstairs, Stella. She's ruining the upholstery." The dismissal was absolute. He didn't look up. Sadie was no longer a person. She was a damp inconvenience. "Stand up, girl," Stella ordered softly. Sadie obeyed because she didn't know what else to do. Her legs wobbled, the joints stiff and aching from the cold. She clutched the teacup to her chest like a shield, the warm towel draped around her shoulders. She followed Stella out of the study, not daring to look back at the man behind the desk. The hallway felt endless. They climbed a sweeping mahogany staircase, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps completely. The silence of the house was oppressive. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant sirens, no arguing neighbors. It was the terrifying, insulated quiet of immense wealth. Stella opened a heavy oak door and flipped a switch. Soft, warm light flooded a bedroom that was larger than Sadie's entire apartment. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in thick, dark blue quilts. There was a sitting area, a heavy wooden armoire, and a door leading to an ensuite bathroom. "In there," Stella pointed to the bathroom. "Strip. Leave the wet clothes on the tiles. There's a robe on the back of the door. I will return in 20 minutes. Stella stepped out and pulled the door shut. The lock didn't click. Sadie stood in the middle of the room, the teacup cooling in her hands. She set it down on a polished nightstand and walked into the bathroom. The floor was heated. The realization made a fresh, hysterical tear slip down her cheek. She was $50,000 in debt to a monster, and she was standing on heated marble. She peeled off her clothes. The wet denim clung to her skin, peeling away with a sickening cold squelch. The oversized sweater was heavy with rainwater. She dropped them in a pathetic heap on the floor. Catching her reflection in the massive mirror over the double vanity, Sadie stopped. She looked like a corpse. Her skin was a translucent, sickly pale, making the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. And then there was the actual bruise, a blossoming, ugly, purplish-red mark swelling high on her left cheekbone, where her head had cracked against her apartment wall. Her ribs poked through her pale skin, a testament to weeks of skipping meals to buy her father's painkillers. She turned on the shower. The water was instantly hot. She stepped under the spray, letting it beat down on the back of her neck. She scrubbed her skin with a bar of unscented soap until she was raw, trying to wash away the smell of the city, the smell of her father's decay, the smell of the bald man's leather glove. When she finally turned the water off, she was lightheaded. She dried herself roughly and put on the thick white terry cloth robe hanging on the door. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. She walked back into the bedroom. A pair of neatly folded grey sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt sat on the edge of the bed. Stella had come and gone without making a sound. Sadie put the clothes on. They were men's clothes, soft and smelling of expensive detergent. She crawled into the massive bed, pulling the heavy blue quilt up to her chin. She expected to lie awake, her heart pounding with terror, plotting a way out of the window. But her body betrayed her. The warmth, the exhaustion, and the profound crash of adrenaline dragged her down into a heavy, dreamless black immediately. Sunlight, aggressive and bright, sliced through the gap in the heavy curtains, striking Sadie directly in the eyes. She bolted upright, a sharp gasp tearing from her dry throat. Her heart slammed against her ribs in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. For 3 agonizing seconds, she didn't know where she was. The heavy quilt, the vast room, the silence, it was all wrong. Then the memory of the wet wool coats and the mahogany desk crashed over her. She scrambled backward against the tufted headboard, pulling her knees to her chest. She listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just the faint, rhythmic hum of central air conditioning. Her stomach let out a loud, hollow groan. The hunger wasn't a dull ache anymore. It was a sharp, clawing pain. Sadie cautiously slid off the high bed. Her bare feet hit the thick carpet. She walked to the window and pushed the heavy fabric aside. The view made her breath catch. The estate was surrounded by acres of dense, dark woods. A high, wrought-iron fence ran along the perimeter, equipped with security cameras perched like black gargoyles at regular intervals. There was no fire escape. There was no bustling street below to disappear into. She was completely isolated. She turned back to the room. Her old clothes were gone. Her sneakers were gone. She had nothing but the oversized sweatpants and the white t-shirt. Survival instinct, base and primal, overrode her terror. She needed water. She needed food. If they were going to kill her, they would have done it last night. She opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. She crept down the heavy staircase, her bare feet making no sound. She followed the subtle scent of roasted coffee beans and sizzling fat. The kitchen was a sprawling industrial space, disguised as a country hearth. Stainless steel appliances gleamed against exposed brick walls. At the center sat a massive butcher block island. Albert Costello sat at a small round table in the corner, bathed in the morning light filtering through a bay window. He was wearing a dark grey suit, though the jacket was draped over the back of his chair. He was reading a physical newspaper, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, a small porcelain cup of dark espresso in his hand. He didn't look up as she hovered in the doorway. "There's a plate on the counter," he said. His voice was gravelly, a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet kitchen. Sadie froze. She looked toward the butcher block. A plate sat there holding 2 pieces of dry toast, a small pile of scrambled eggs, and 3 strips of bacon. Her mouth watered so violently it physically ached. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes darting between Albert and the food. He calmly turned a page of the newspaper. The crisp rustle of the paper was deafening. She reached the counter. She didn't sit down. She picked up a piece of toast with a trembling hand and took a bite. The crunch was loud. She chewed, frantically swallowing before it was fully mashed, the dry bread scraping down her throat. She picked up a piece of bacon and ate it just as fast, the salt and fat sending a dizzying rush to her brain. She ate like a stray dog, hunched over, eyes darting, expecting the meal to be snatched away at any second. "Sit down," Albert commanded softly. Sadie stopped chewing. She looked at the heavy wooden stool tucked under the island, then slowly pulled it out and sat keeping her hands flat on the counter beside the plate. Albert folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. He took off his glasses. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over the oversized men's clothes, the wet, messy knot of hair on top of her head, and finally settling on her face. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight into a violent, ugly smear of purple and yellow. His jaw tightened infinitesimally. He picked up his espresso, took a slow sip, and set it down. "Your father," Albert began, leaning forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, "was a weak man. He borrowed money he knew he couldn't repay. He lied to my associates. He lied to me. He thought dying would clear his ledger." Sadie stared at her plate. A lump formed in her throat, thick and suffocating. She couldn't defend Thomas Miller. He had been a weak man. He had drunk away their rent, their food, and finally his own life. "The total is $51,000. Albert continued, his tone purely transactional, devoid of malice or sympathy. "You do not have it. You do not have assets to liquidate. You are entirely without resources." "I know," Sadie whispered. Her voice was scratchy. "Look at me when I speak to you." The command wasn't yelled, but the absolute authority in it snapped Sadie's head up. She met his pale blue eyes. They were cold, calculating, but there was a strange, heavy anchor in them that kept her from looking away. So Albert said, "We have a problem. A debt unpaid is a precedent I do not allow. It breeds disrespect. But you—" He studied her face again, his eyes lingering on the bruise. "You are not built for the streets. If I put you out to earn it the way others do, you'd be dead in a week. And a corpse pays no interest." Sadie's stomach twisted. The food she had just inhaled threatened to come back up. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. "You belong to the house now," Albert stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact as immutable as gravity. "You will work here. You will assist Stella. You will clean. You will learn the filing systems for my legitimate businesses. You will not leave the grounds. You will not contact anyone from your previous life." Sadie blinked, her mind struggling to process the terms. A maid, a secretary. It felt too mundane, too safe for a man who ordered doors kicked in. "For how long?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. Albert looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The silence stretched until the air in the kitchen felt too thin to breathe. "Until I say the debt is cleared," he answered softly. He stood up, retrieving his suit jacket from the back of the chair. He shrugged it on, adjusting the cuffs with practiced precision. "Stella will give you a list of duties," Albert said, turning toward the hallway. He paused, looking back over his shoulder at her small, trembling form, perched on the heavy wooden stool. "Do not try to run, Sadie. The woods are dark, and my men are not as patient as I am." He walked out, his heavy, slightly uneven footsteps fading down the hall, leaving Sadie alone with the cold remains of her breakfast and the crushing realization that she had just traded a shoebox apartment for a velvet cage. Lemon oil and beeswax, That became the smell of her survival. Stella did not tolerate dust, and she did not tolerate idleness. By 6 in the morning, Sadie was in a stiff grey cotton uniform that smelled heavily of industrial starch, her knees pressed against the cold hardwood floors with a rag in her hand. The work was brutal on her unaccustomed joints. Her lower back ached with a dull, persistent throb, and her cuticles bled from the harsh chemical cleaners. Yet there was a sickening, contradictory comfort in the routine. For the last 3 years, Sadie's life had been an agonizing tightrope walk. Wake up, check if her father was breathing, check if he had stolen her tip money, check the locks, check the window, wait for the eviction notice. Here behind the high iron gates, the chaos was gone, replaced by a cold, sterile order. And there was food. It was the most shameful part of her captivity. She was a prisoner indentured to a man who broke legs and ruined lives, but she ate better than she ever had. Stella cooked heavy, rich meals, roast pork shoulder, thick potato stews, fresh sourdough bread that snapped perfectly when torn. Sadie would sit on a stool in the massive kitchen, chewing slowly, hating herself for the way her mouth watered, for the way her hollow cheeks began to fill out. Her body didn't care about morals. Her body just wanted to live. Albert Costello was a phantom during daylight hours. A heavy black town car would crunch down the gravel driveway by 8, carrying him into the city, and wouldn't return until the sun was well below the tree line. Sadie learned his habits by cleaning up the remnants of his existence. He drank his scotch with a single cube of ice. He smoked exactly 2 cigars a week, leaving ash in the heavy crystal tray on the patio. He read voraciously. History mostly. Dense, dry biographies of dead generals and fallen empires. It was day 12 when the phantom materialized out of schedule. Sadie was in the study. Stella had tasked her with oiling the lower bookshelves, a tedious job that required a soft cloth and a steady hand. The house was dead quiet. She was humming a tuneless, nervous melody under her breath, a habit she developed to fill the oppressive silence her back to the heavy mahogany doors. "You missed a spot on the left." The gravelly voice dropped into the room like a stone. Sadie gasped, her hand jerking violently. The bottle of lemon oil tipped, spilling a yellow pool onto the Persian rug. Albert stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and he looked incredibly profoundly exhausted. The deep lines framing his mouth seemed carved from granite. Panic seized Sadie's throat. She dropped to her knees, frantically scrubbing at the oil stain on the priceless rug with her cloth, making it worse, spreading it into the fibers. "I'm sorry, I'll clean it. I'm sorry." Footsteps approached. Slow, uneven. He stopped right beside her. She kept her head down, staring at the perfectly polished tips of his leather shoes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced for the anger, a shout, a kick. Instead, he let out a slow, heavy sigh. It sounded like an old engine struggling to turn over. "Leave it, Sadie. Stella will have a solvent for it." She froze her hands, hovering over the stained wool. She didn't dare look up. "Stand up." Her knees popped as she obeyed, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the knot of his loosened tie. She was shaking again. It frustrated her. She had been doing so well convincing herself she was just an employee, a ghost in the walls. But his physical presence shattered the illusion. He smelled of rain-stale tobacco smoke and copper. Albert reached past her. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth. He paused. His arm hovered in the air, mere inches from her shoulder. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The clinical calculating gaze was back. He studied her flinch, the rigid tension in her neck, the way her eyes were squeezed shut in absolute anticipation of pain. He withdrew his arm slowly and stepped back, giving her space. "I was reaching for a book," he said softly. Sadie opened her eyes, her chest heaving. She felt ridiculous. She felt small. Albert moved to the shelf opposite her and pulled down a thick leather-bound volume. He held it in his large, scarred hand, running a thumb over the gold leaf spine. Fear is a useful tool, Sadie. It keeps a person alive. But indiscriminate fear, flinching at shadows, waiting for a blow that isn't coming, that will rot your nerves from the inside out. He didn't wait for a response. He walked around his massive desk, the slight drag in his step more pronounced today, and sank heavily into his chair. He opened the book. The dismissal was clear. Sadie backed out of the room, her hands trembling by her sides. She practically ran down the hallway, the smell of lemon oil clinging to her skin, her mind spinning. He was a monster. She knew what he was. But monsters were supposed to scream. Monsters were supposed to hit. Albert Costello's quiet, observant stillness terrified her more than any raised fist ever could. Rain returned on a Tuesday, drumming a chaotic, violent rhythm against the thick glass of the estate's windows. It had been 3 weeks. The ugly purple bruise on Sadie's cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, and finally completely vanished. Looking in the bathroom mirror that evening, she barely recognized herself. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. Her skin had color. The grey uniform hung slightly less loosely on her frame. She turned off the bathroom light, feeling a profound, nauseating wave of guilt. Her father was rotting in a cheap pine box in a city cemetery, and she was getting healthy in the house of the man who held his debt. It was past midnight. Stella had retired to her quarters hours ago. Sadie was in the massive kitchen, sitting in the dark, drinking a glass of cold water. Sleep eluded her on nights when the rain sounded like this. It sounded too much like the night her door was kicked in. A sharp electronic buzz shattered the quiet. Sadie jumped, splashing water onto her hand. The intercom on the wall glowed with a faint red light. She walked over, wiping her wet hand on her cotton apron, and pressed the brass button. "Yes," she whispered, her voice raspy in the dark. "Bring the black ledger from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet to the study." Albert's voice. He was home. She hadn't heard the car. "Right away," she said, releasing the button. Her stomach gave a familiar, anxious flutter. She walked down the long, shadowed hallway. The house felt entirely different at night. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the walls, making the antique furniture look like crouching beasts. She opened the door to the study. The only light came from a green glass banker's lamp on the desk. Albert was sitting in his armchair by the cold hearth, not at his desk. He held a crystal glass in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He looked up as she entered. Sadie walked to the heavy iron filing cabinet in the corner. It wasn't locked. She pulled open the bottom drawer. The metal squealed in protest. She found the thick black leather ledger, its edges worn soft from years of use. It was remarkably heavy. She carried it over to him. She didn't know whether to hand it to him or set it on the small table beside his chair. She hesitated, hovering awkwardly. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite his with his glass. Sadie swallowed hard. She perched on the very edge of the leather cushion, keeping the heavy ledger in her lap like a shield. She didn't lean back. Albert took a slow drink of his scotch. He rested his elbow on the armrest, rubbing his temple with 2 fingers. "Open it to page 42. Sadie opened the book. The pages were thick, expensive paper. They were filled with columns of neat, precise handwriting in black ink. Dates, names, numbers. "Read the 3rd line down," he ordered. Sadie traced her finger down the page. "O'Connor, 300,000, 6% monthly. What does that equate to in a year compounding?" Sadie blinked. She looked up at him. He wasn't looking at the book. He was looking intently at her face. I don't have a calculator," she stammered. "Use your head, Sadie. You managed the till at a diner during the lunch rush. You calculated tips and taxes in your sleep." Do the math? She stared down at the numbers. The panic flared, but the absolute stillness in his voice forced her to focus. She bit her lower lip, her brow furrowing. She multiplied the base, factored the interest, carried the ones in her head. It took her a full minute. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rain lashing the glass. 364,000, she said quietly, roughly. $364,418, Albert corrected smoothly. Close enough. He set his glass down on the table. The ice clinked sharply. Your father was a fool, but you are not, Albert said. It wasn't a compliment, it was an assessment. You scrub floors because Stella tells you to, but you watch everything. You memorize the grocery orders. You know which floorboards creak. You know exactly what time the shift changes at the front gate. Sadie's blood ran cold. She thought she had been invisible. She thought she was blending into the wallpaper. I'm not trying to run, she blurted out, her voice cracking with sudden desperation. I swear, Mr. Costello, I haven't. Quiet. The word severed her sentence instantly. She snapped her mouth shut, her chest heaving. Albert leaned forward. The dim green light cast heavy shadows under his eyes, making him look ancient and dangerous. If I thought you were trying to run, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair. I am making an observation. You have a brain, and right now it is wasting away in a bucket of bleach. He pointed to the ledger in her lap. Stella's hands are failing her. Arthritis. She can no longer manage the books for the legitimate fronts, the laundromats, the sanitation contracts, the real estate holding companies. It requires a quiet mouth and a sharp mind. Sadie stared at him, completely uncomprehending. You want me to do your accounting? I want you to learn. He corrected. You will spend 3 hours a day in this room with me. You will reconcile the clean books. If you are a penny off, you will do it again until you bleed from the eyes. If you speak a word of what you see on these pages to anyone, I won't kill you. I will simply open the front gate and let the men who bought your father's debt handle you. The threat was delivered with a chilling conversational ease. It was a promise. He was offering her a promotion wrapped in a death sentence. He was pulling her out of the kitchen and dropping her directly into the nerve center of his empire. Why? Sadie whispered. The word slipped out before she could stop it. I'm just collateral. Why trust me with this? Albert looked at her. He looked at her clean hair, her clear eyes, the way she clutched the ledger so tightly her knuckles were white. He saw the utter absence of ambition, the pure, distilled instinct for survival. Because Sadie, Albert said, softly picking his scotch back up. You are the only person in this house who is entirely, perfectly terrified of me. And fear makes a very meticulous bookkeeper. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the crystal glass. The air between them was thick electric and terrifyingly complex. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a piece on his board. And as the rain continued to beat against the heavy glass, Sadie realized with sickening clarity that stepping closer to the monster might be the only way to survive him. Ink stained the pad of her index finger, a deep, permanent blue that soap and hot water could no longer scrub away. It had been 4 months since Sadie traded the lemon oil for the heavy brass fountain pen. The transition was agonizing. For the first few weeks she sat at the small side desk in Albert's study, rigid with terror, terrified that a misplaced decimal would result in a bullet. But Albert never yelled. He simply pointed to her errors with a blunt, manicured fingernail, forcing her to recount columns of dirty money disguised as real estate acquisitions until her vision blurred and her temples throbbed. She learned the rhythm of his breathing. She learned that a rapid tapping of his silver pen meant a shipment had been intercepted, and that complete dead silence meant someone was about to disappear. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. Frost coated the window panes, blurring the security lights on the perimeter fence into glowing amber halos. The study was suffocatingly warm, smelling of dry wood smoke and the sharp medicinal tang of Albert's scotch. Sadie dragged her pen down a column of figures from a waste management front in Queens. She stopped. The numbers didn't reconcile. It wasn't a glaring error, it was a subtle, deliberate bleed. $4,000 skimmed off the top of the fuel budget over 3 months. A rounding error to a man like Albert, but a glaring red flag in the meticulously balanced ledger. Her heart kicked up a notch. She stared at the page, her breath hitching. To point it out was to accuse a capo of stealing. To ignore it was to fail Albert's singular condition for her survival. She closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the leather covers sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Albert looked up from his armchair. He was reading a file, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The firelight carved deep, shadowed canyons into his face. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Sadie stood up. Her knees didn't wobble anymore. She walked across the Persian rug, clutching the thick book to her chest, and stopped just outside the circle of heat cast by the hearth. "There's a discrepancy," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. Albert lowered his file. "Show me." She stepped closer, invading his space, and opened the ledger on the small table next to his drink. She leaned over, pointing to the column with her ink-stained finger. "Russo's sanitation run. The fuel costs are inflated by 12% compared to the actual mileage logged on the trucks. Someone is pocketing $4,000. Albert didn't look at the book. He looked at her hand. Then he slowly followed the line of her arm up to her face. He leaned forward, the leather chair groaning under his weight. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could smell the bitter tobacco clinging to his vest. Panic, old and familiar, flared in the base of her throat, but she clamped down on it. She forced herself to meet his pale blue eyes. "You are accusing Vincent Russo of skimming," Albert stated softly. The gravel in his voice scraped against her nerves. "I'm pointing out that the numbers are fabricated," Sadie countered, keeping her chin level. "What you do with that information is your business." Albert stared at her. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. He reached out. Sadie's breath caught, but she planted her feet. She did not raise her arms. She did not close her eyes. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. His large, calloused hand came up, but he didn't strike her. He bypassed her face entirely, his fingers lightly gripping her wrist. His touch was burning hot, his thumb pressing directly over her frantic pulse. He looked down at the blue ink stain on her finger, then back up to her eyes. "You stopped flinching?" he murmured. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that sent a cold, terrifying thrill straight down Sadie's spine. He released her wrist and picked up his scotch. "Vincent Russo will be dealt with by morning," Albert said, casually taking a slow sip. "Close the book, Sadie. We are done for the night." She stepped back, pulling the ledger away. She felt dizzy, a sick, heavy knot forming in her stomach. By pointing out the error, she had just signed a man's death warrant. And the most terrifying part wasn't the blood on her hands. It was the fact that she didn't care. Vincent Russo was just a misplaced number, and she had balanced the book. Snow piled against the wrought iron gates in heavy, suffocating drifts. The estate was entirely cut off from the city, wrapped in a suffocating white silence. It was late December. Exactly 6 months since the men kicked down her apartment door. Sadie sat at her desk in the study, wearing a dark cashmere sweater Stella had left on her bed 2 weeks prior. She was auditing a string of laundromats, her mind numb to the staggering amounts of illicit cash moving through the columns. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Albert walked in, bringing a rush of frigid hallway air with him. He limped heavily, leaning on a silver-handled cane he only used when the damp cold settled deep into his old gunshot wounds. He didn't go to his armchair. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 heavy measures of scotch into crystal glasses, and walked over to her small desk. He set one glass down precisely beside her inkwell. Sadie stopped writing. She looked at the amber liquid, then up at Albert. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shoulders looked broader in just the vest and rolled-up shirt sleeves, his presence entirely overwhelming the small corner of the room. "Drink," he ordered softly. She picked up the heavy glass. The crystal was cold. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. It burned like liquid fire, scorching a path down her throat and settling as a heavy, spreading heat in her chest. She coughed sharply, her eyes watering. Albert watched her taking a slow, smooth drink from his own glass. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. He dropped it onto her desk, right over her open ledger. Sadie blinked away the tears from the alcohol. She looked down. It was a promissory note. At the bottom, in a shaky, desperate scrawl, was her father's signature. Thomas Miller. Below it, the sum, $42,500. $51,000 with interest. Albert said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "You have balanced the accounts. You found the Russo leak saving me a significant ongoing hemorrhage. You reorganized the holding companies, cutting our tax liability by a margin that more than covers this pathetic piece of paper." He pulled his silver fountain pen from his breast pocket, unscrewed the cap, and laid it gently on top of the promissory note. "Strike a line through the signature," Albert commanded. Sadie stared at the silver pen. Her hand began to tremble, a fine, violent vibration that rattled the ice in her glass. This was it. This was the end of the nightmare. She was free. She picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy. She pressed the gold nib to the paper right above her father's desperate, drunken signature and drew a thick black line straight through it. The sound of the scratch was deafening. "The debt is cleared," Albert stated flatly. "The gate will be opened at dawn. The driver will take you wherever you wish to go in the city. There is an envelope in your room with $10,000. Clean money. Severance." He turned away, walking heavily back toward his desk. Sadie sat frozen. The scotch burned in her stomach. She looked out the window at the high iron gates, barely visible through the falling snow. Beyond those gates was the city. The peeling linoleum. The smell of stale beer. The desperate, scraping panic of trying to survive on minimum wage, constantly looking over her shoulder, completely alone. She looked around the study. The warm fire. The smell of old leather and expensive tobacco. The brutal, unforgiving safety of Albert Costello's shadow. She had traded her soul for a warm bed, and the terrifying truth was, she didn't want it back. She was no longer the girl who starved in that apartment. That girl died the day she stopped flinching. No. The word slipped out of her mouth before her brain could catch up. It was quiet, but it hung in the air like shattered glass. Albert stopped halfway across the room. He slowly turned around. His pale blue eyes narrowed, calculating, searching her face for the punchline of a joke he didn't understand. "Excuse me," he said softly. Sadie stood up. Her legs were perfectly steady. She picked up the cancelled promissory note and tore it exactly in half, dropping the pieces onto the Persian rug. "I said no," she repeated, her voice gaining traction. "I'm not leaving." Albert walked back toward her. His limp pronounced, his jaw set. He stopped inches from her, towering over her, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, dangerous rhythm. "You are a free woman, Sadie. The ledger is balanced. I do not keep pets." "I'm not a pet." She shot back, tilting her head up to meet his glare. The alcohol made her bold. The truth made her reckless. "I am your bookkeeper. I know exactly how you move the sanitation money. I know the shell companies in Delaware. You send me out there, I'm a liability. You keep me here, I'm an asset." Albert stared at her. The air between them crackled thick thick and heavy with something far more dangerous than fear. He saw the cold, hard logic in her eyes. He saw his own absolute corruption reflected back at him in a 22-year-old girl. He reached out. This time there was no hesitation. His large, rough hand cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed over the exact spot where the ugly bruise had been 6 months ago. His touch was possessive, heavy, anchoring her to the floor. Sadie didn't pull away. She leaned into the calloused heat of his palm, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, surrendering completely to the velvet trap. "No man has ever touched you." Albert murmured, his voice a low, gravelly scrape against her skin, echoing the words he had spoken on her first terrified night. But the context was entirely shattered. It was no longer an observation of her innocence. It was a territorial claim. "No," Sadie whispered, opening her eyes to look directly into the cold, pale gaze of the monster she had chosen. "Only you. Did you expect Sadie to embrace the darkness? Her transformation from a terrified captive to a willing participant in Albert's criminal empire is exactly why we love slow-burn, morally grey romance." The cage door was open, but the real captivity was in her mind. If this raw, deeply imperfect dynamic kept you hooked, do me a massive favor, smash that. Like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance readers, and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below. Did Sadie make the right choice, or did she just sign away her soul? See you in the next story.